I'm Dr. Fadi Shayya. I'm an architect, urbanist, and researcher, and I'm giving the workshop Intimate Legacies as part of the larger workshop of the Lebanon Unsettled project. In 2019, I was not in Lebanon. I was abroad in the UK studying for my PhD. So I was not directly involved, but I was involved through support networks. I'm not a big social media person, but at the same time, I have a lot of connections, would stay in touch with people, ask if they need anything, how they're doing, if possible, financial support, if not, other kind of support, other kind of advocacy efforts needed. I think the 2019 protests, I agree with everyone who says that they are a major milestone in the change of Lebanese polity, not necessarily in the actual politics that are ongoing through the elections and through governance, but the polity itself, like the fact that more people became involved, more people became aware of the situation. A lot of people started to get out from their comfort zone, from their, let's call it frankly as it is, from the sectarian comfort zone. But at the same time, I think that Lebanon being Lebanon and people being initiators and entrepreneurs, I think there were a lot of voices which added diversity to the whole discussion, but at the same time, it did not bring in solidarity and alliance in a way that is required for a specific change to happen. Nevertheless, I think it is a major point, not only politically at the level of the policies, but I think also in relation, literally, I've seen relations between kids and their parents change. I've seen relations between young millennials and their involvement change. I've seen our generation, some of the people who are passive, become more active, more involved. So I think it was a major change in polity and in the way of life that we do in Lebanon. I think the 2019 protest event is not, it is situated in historical, longue durée kind of historical events, like the big sectarianism theme or the corruption theme that keeps coming up, from 1860s and before the 1860s. But more or less, I think this is one of the first protests after the war, so in the post-war era, post-Civil War era, so after the 1989-1990 ceasefire. I think it's one of the major protests where people actually take to the streets against, everyday social issues. I think that the establishing protest for this protest was the 2005 protest after the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri. But that one was more of a political camp against a political camp. But things developed in a way where people became more aware of their everyday life issues, of the economic, socioeconomic situation, of the cultural situation. So this is not a protest that is in vacuum. It definitely has a lot of things that happened back in the 90s, in the 2000s, but I think it's one of a kind in terms of addressing politics versus socioeconomic issues. Even in the 2008 global crisis, we were lucky not to suffer as other people suffered. But I think, again, looking back in retrospective right now, I think this is also why we had the crisis. It was a delayed crisis. We had it in 2019. So much for that, 2008 not suffering, but it came down all collapsing and crashing in 2019. I think this is one of the major historical events in modern Lebanon's history. And funny enough that it coincides almost 100 years, literally 2 years after, or literally 100 years after the official announcement or creation of the so-called Lebanon as it is today in 1920s. So I think this historical political significance, we still do not understand its dimensions, but I think it means something, and the coming years will show how it will unfold. The geography of the protest is a very interesting geography in the sense that it was decentralized, unlike the usual calls for decentralization in policy or in law or in socioeconomic issues. So this decentralization is at the core of showing that on the one hand, that the center itself is not Beirut, or the center itself is not enough. On the other hand, the decentralization also shows that there is momentum and energy and agency in different places. Now that could be a positive thing, it could be a negative thing. And in the sense that every geopolitics has its own group of people. Now, the decentralization does not imply a hybrid or a mixed group of people. But I think there was a certain understanding because of the common socioeconomic issues that even though people belong to different circles, different communities, different sects, different political and ideological orientations, I think there was a common understanding that people supported each other. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see how, despite the decentralization, you would still see people divided into groups, only brought together by certain claims in that sense. Another interesting thing about the spatiality is the place where these protests take place. So they take place in squares. Obviously, this is the obvious historical place for protest. It's in the middle of a town. It's central to everybody. But it also takes place on highways. It takes place next to maybe, even before the protests of 2019. So you have protests next to dumpsters or to, not dumpsters, maybe dump sites, next to infrastructure sites. So it goes away from the square. It gives away to the wider spatial understanding of things like the highway, disrupting transportation, people joining, even if they're in their cars, joining the protests, burning wheels, all that kind of stuff. So this gives a different spatial dimension also. Again, not to only decentralize from Beirut, but to decentralize from the square itself.